Our ability to pick and choose what software we run on devices we own and not have software forced down our throats is going to be like one of the most foundational human rights issues of the next 100 years. Basically, every app whose business model is rooted in surveillance advertising is collecting some type of sensitive data on you, and then that data can be bought and sold. I feel like so many of these folks that say they want to protect kids are just not actually interested in listening to kids. And it's really hard to protect kids when you don't listen to them.
Hi, Rabble.
Hey, Alice.
So today on the podcast, you were talking to Evan Greer from Fight for the Future. Fight for the Future is a nonprofit group that has been behind some of the largest online protests in human history. Evan is a director there. So tell us a little bit about how you met Evan and why you wanted to have her on the podcast today.
Yeah, I know her from years of activism and years of collaboration in terms of the social movements where we're running campaigns to keep the internet free and open, not controlled by corporations, not put into a world of a surveillance state. Fight for the Future is this amazing grassroots activist campaign group that has fought for so much of what is good in the internet. And they do this interesting thing where they organize millions of people online, but they also go and talk to the politicians. They talk to people inside Washington about what they're doing. And they try and find solutions that understand where people are coming from. This is what you're talking about. People are concerned about what's happening about kids. People are concerned about the implications of the social media companies and the way in which they're using algorithms. And so she's able to understand where people are coming from and give credit when people that she's opposing have different views. And I really wanted to have her on Fight for the Future or on the podcast because it's an example of a group that's not just, building technology or building social media apps, but really engaged in the activism of how do we make the internet a better place for all of us.
That's right. And, we're all parents. She is as well. And I thought she was very compassionate about the parents who have lost their children to, awful circumstances that have come about through social media, and isn't blaming them for how these laws are manifesting, but is saying the lawmakers deserve, they deserve for the lawmakers to do a better job when they come to them begging for help. And so I know that's something that you're seeing in New Zealand as well.
Absolutely. We need to do things but we need to make sure that we don't have unintended consequences when we do them. We need to make sure that what we do to make social media safer doesn't harm queer and trans kids. We need to make sure that we realize that there's a diversity of stuff. And we talked about the importance of working with young people to help them shape their online experience rather than simply attempting at blanket bans.
And then another unintended consequence, which we have talked about in the past too, is that some of these laws, in effect, let the big corporations off the hook. Because if you just ban everyone under 16, they go, well, not my problem if they were online and they weren't supposed to be, right?
Or they set up regulation that only the largest corporations in the world could ever comply with. And so that means that new startups or open source technology or the ideas of what we're trying to do with Divine couldn't come to exist because we can't afford the hundreds of millions of dollars that would be required to comply with the laws.
Let's take a listen. And, I think this was a really, really great conversation.
Today on Revolution Social, I'm very excited to have Evan Greer, director of Fight for the Future. They are the advocacy group that works both to organize activists around the internet for internet freedom, for making the internet a safe place to change the world, a safe place for all of us. And they work inside the Beltway, inside Washington, doing lobbying, but also mobilizing grassroots movements. So welcome, Evan.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Great to chat.
You and your work with Fight for the Future are this really interesting group because you're out there fighting to make the internet a free place for all of us, a place where we can organize, a place where people can recognize it, a place where we have the ability to have privacy. I'm a huge fan of Fight for the Future. I'm a huge fan of the work you've done. You've led so many campaigns about SOPA PIPA, the day we fight back, around internet surveillance, around the campaign to protect net neutrality and defend the internet and let us use it without handing over IDs and without being able to controlled either by the state or corporations. And so I would love for you to talk a little bit about the organization of Fight for the Future and some of the work that you've been doing.
Yeah, for sure. So Fight for the Future was founded in 2012, and we're probably best known, as you mentioned, for helping organize some of the largest online protests in human history. So some of your listeners may remember the SOPA blackout, when tens of thousands of websites, including Wikipedia and many other very popular ones, blacked out to protest copyright legislation that could have led to widespread internet censorship. And this was actually a year before I joined Fight for the Future, so I can't claim any credit for this, which means I can kind of like brag about it on behalf of our co-founders and others that started the organization. But they drove 8 million phone calls to Congress in a single day. And while I generally have always been someone who's like pretty skeptical of the legislative process and that kind of inside baseball of what can we accomplish within the restrictions of Washington, D.C., I think that was a moment where we proved that the internet, social media, allowing people to connect and express themselves at a scale that had previously been impossible was sort of rewriting the rules for what we can accomplish within a representative democracy. And sort of, Fight for the Future was maybe one of those digital rights groups that was sort of early adopters in terms of creating online tools to make it easier for people to express themselves. And in doing so, we sort of hacked the political process a little bit. And we kept doing that with some of our campaigns around net neutrality, where we were up against the telecom industry, one of the wealthiest and most politically entrenched industries in the history of humanity, and we were able to accomplish some victories that traditional DC logic would have said were impossible. And I would argue that a big part of that was, again, because of the technology, because of the internet, because of social media, giving ordinary people a voice in policy in a way that they hadn't had previously. But then the flip side of that, as you mentioned, is, and it's not like we were naive to this even 10 or 15 years ago, but it has obviously become increasingly clear in the age of surveillance-driven social media, centralized big tech, corporate-controlled social media platforms, that dream or that vision of the internet as a liberatory technology is very much contested. And I would argue that it's not over. I think those that claim that the internet is akin to cigarettes or, is just all bad for humanity are wrong and are not contending with the ways that power has been changed and redistributed by connective technologies. But I also think, the kind of tech utopian or refusal to contend with the ways that connected technologies can also centralize power and, lead to some of the real growth of authoritarianism and fascist practices that we've seen around the world. I think like that is true as well. And so Fight for the Future very much sits at this intersection, and we see technology as a battlefield that is essential and will sort of dictate, whether we're living in a fascist dystopia or whether we can actually reclaim some power for the people and move ourselves toward the type of world that I know we all want to grow up in. And I'll just lastly say, I know we're going to get into talking more about kids and young people and the internet. And I'll just say for me as a parent of a teenager, when I think about this stuff and, if someone asks me like, what really is your goal? It's like, I want my kid to grow up in a world where she can express herself, where she has tools to try to shape the world and change it, and where she has access to information. And that's really kind of what I'm fighting for in the end, is like, how do we keep our kids safe? I would argue we keep them safe by empowering them and informing them and giving them the tools to advocate for themselves, rather than by trying to keep them away from information, keep them ignorant and naive. Frankly, I would argue that that makes them easier to control rather than making them safer.
I almost wonder if that isn't the thing anyone would say. They don't want to say, oh, yes, we're trying to control the kids or everything else, but a desire to put kids back in a box. I think that so much of the anti-trans backlash is a fear that all of a sudden, when trans people were able to connect to each other on social media and on the internet, all of these people came out of the closet. And there's a bunch of conservatives who just wished it didn't happen and would be perfectly happy for everybody going back in the closet and losing that community. And social media has become so important for this massive community of people. Unless you move to particular enclaves, unless you manage to find that community in a few specific safe cities, we're stuck in the shadows.
Yeah, and not only stuck in the shadows, but you hear from a lot of trans people stuck without any access to even a representation of ourselves. I've know so many trans people my age. I'm 40. I'm sort of in that elder millennial, grew up with AOL Instant Messenger, but before sort of the advent of social media. But we found the very first representations for many of us, it was meeting another trans person in a chat room or seeing another trans content creator that made a funny video on Vine, and I hear that so much continually now today from young people. And I think one of the things it's done, as you said, is made trans community so much more accessible, particularly for low-income youth, for youth that live in rural areas, for youth that don't have supportive and safe parents. And that's huge, right? That is life-saving, and we shouldn't underestimate the degree to which it is. And in fact, even the US government's own research shows that. So for example, we saw a big report from the US Surgeon General. This was back during the Biden administration. And the report was largely sort of followed the same slant as a lot of the mainstream reporting on this issue that tends to, focus in on negative mental health outcomes for youth when using social media, which again, I don't actually contend with. I completely think that a surveillance-driven, algorithmically manipulated social media platform like Instagram is harmful to youth and to everyone else. But what it actually showed is that access to social media for LGBTQ youth specifically actually leads to better mental health outcomes than trans youth and queer youth that don't have access to social media. And so we can actually see in the data that access to online community is a suicide prevention tool. It is a tool that reduces depression and anxiety for trans and queer youth and leads to more likelihood of academic success, employment. Every metric shows us, and this isn't, you don't have to be a child psychologist to understand, having access to community, supportive community, other teenagers that share my experience makes me more likely to succeed, more likely to pursue my goals, more likely to feel safe and secure in my identity, more likely to access the healthcare and mental health support that I need. I mean, none of this stuff is a mystery, but I think again, part of where we're stuck in is my childhood. The mainstream version of this was about video games, and that video games are causing violence, rather than
or Dungeons and Dragons, or
comic books, or Magic the Gathering cards, or heavy metal music, or anything and everything other than inequality, lack of access to healthcare and housing, lack of access to healthy food, all the things that we actually know are data-driven drivers of violence, harm, poverty, etc. Those are hard issues to solve. And so politicians tend to focus in on these. Well, if we just ban this type of music, if we just kick kids off of the internet, then all these problems will go away. And it's just never that simple. And it feels like we're again stuck in, it's the same bad thinking that went into abstinence-only sex education, which we know was a complete failure and does not prevent kids from having sex. And so what it ends up doing is making them have unsafe sex. Whereas we know that evidence-based sex education, where young people are taught about consent and autonomy and how to set boundaries and how to keep themselves safe, lead to better outcomes for young people. And I think we're just stuck in that same debate with social media, where it's rooted in this wrong idea that we protect kids by keeping them ignorant. And I think we protect kids by empowering them and informing them and giving them access to information.
Yeah, I had Pamela Wineski on the podcast earlier, and she's a researcher, and her research was, how do you work with teens and adolescents so that they are part of the process of shaping their social media, so that they have agency, so they aren't just installing spyware on people's computers or blockers or things like that, because all of us do want to have agency into this. And to me, the surprising thing is, yes, there are negative aspects of social media. Yes, absolutely. There are things that go awry, especially in a particular kind of algorithmic consumption where you don't have agency over it. But, at the same time, teen pregnancy rates have dropped massively. Like, teen deaths in traffic accidents have dropped massively. Teen drug abuse and alcohol abuse have dropped massively. The levels of people sort of not understanding consent and being forced into sexual relationships really young has dropped massively. And we forget all of these things. And access to information, access to social media, learning about consent, having ways to connect to community, that's part of what lets people change, and we forget how much it's changed. 20 years ago, we had this crisis of teen pregnancy and drug and alcohol use. And now you see think pieces about why aren't young people having more sex?
It's true, yes. Although now finally we have heated rivalry, which means the young people are back into sex on TV. But I completely agree. And I think that what you just named in terms of societal shift is a huge part of why I care so much about fighting censorship and surveillance specifically. I think we tend to think of privacy as being about what do you have to hide from the government, or being able to kind of keep your own stuff secret. And we tend to think of censorship as being about okay, how do we stop bad things from being said or harmful content from getting out there. But it's so important for me, both of these things, free expression and privacy, are actually about our ability to evolve as a human civilization and to test and question whether our rules and norms are correct. And as you said, things change radically in a fairly short period of time. I mean, I'm trans, I'm a member of the LGBTQ community. It was not 60 years ago that it was illegal to have queer sex in most states in the United States. And it was not very long ago that it was illegal for us to gather in bars and restaurants and cafeteria to organize what became the roots of the queer and trans rights movement that is now sort of mainstream and celebrated and seen as sort of normal and natural. And so, when we put the government in the position to either dictate what is and isn't acceptable to say, or when we enable surveillance that allows us to enforce rules and laws and norms in a sort of totalitarian or perfect manner, what we do is we sort of freeze society exactly where we are. And so what I always say to people, if they're like, well, I don't really care that much about privacy or censorship, I'm like, so you think this is as good as we can get?
Yeah, you think that anybody struggling to make the world a better place, or putting their neck out, or saying this needs to change, that, if we end up in a world that has massive surveillance, where the consequences of speaking out, where the consequences of organizing are much worse than they were before, because if we get rid of encrypted DMs, and I know that you guys have run a campaign to preserve encryption and to fight to keep our rights to have encrypted information. If you get rid of that, then now with artificial intelligence, it becomes very easy to see everybody's conversations. You can basically tap every phone line and see every private message and
analyze them all en masse,
and
which
analyze
I think
them
is
all.
the other thing that has changed even in the last 5 to 10 years. I mean, we've been worried about facial recognition for a long time. Facial recognition is a lot more concerning if every car on the road has 4 cameras on it that are collecting a massive feed of data that you can then analyze, very quickly at scale. So I think some of this surveillance dystopia stuff, it's also about orders of magnitude, or where certain types of technological leaps lead to exponential growth in the degree of surveillance that a government can exert upon its population. And we're getting pretty close to, without things like encrypted communications, near total surveillance of most communications with the exception of stuff like Signal that, is still providing a safe place for people to communicate and organize.
And we see things like the Ring doorbells, where it is a private company that is choosing to hand that information without the checks and balances of court orders over to police who make requests. And, we have a system, a flawed system in Western democracies of checks and balances, of courts, of a legal system that has constraints. And we can design technology that sort of goes around all of those constraints where, instead of having to go to each person and ask them, can I see the recording of your doorbell camera? They can just get Amazon to hand them every doorbell in the country, and you don't know what they're going to use it for. We know they're using it for ICE.
No, and they can, and we know that they've used it. Even this was a few years ago. We know that law enforcement in Los Angeles used it to monitor Black Lives Matter protesters that were simply participating in First Amendment protected protest activities. So, this is the rule of thumb with surveillance and with censorship: is if you build an apparatus for surveillance, it will inevitably get used for whatever those in power want to use it for, whatever its original stated purpose is. And we've seen this post 9/11, all of our surveillance apparatus that was built to allegedly stop terrorism has been repurposed and used to target Muslim communities, Arab communities, to target immigrant communities in the US that have nothing to do with terrorism, and then we see this with censorship as well, where policies that are, purported to address something like sex trafficking end up getting used to censor content related to LGBTQ issues or reproductive health. And so, if you build a system for censorship or surveillance, it will be used by the powerful for their own purposes, regardless of what its original stated intent or even perhaps, genuine intent is. I think often we do build these things with good intentions. And there are good faith people out there. And I want to, we mentioned some of the parents, like at the outset of this. And, I've met some of the parents that are advocating for things like KOSA or age verification legislation. And I've heard their stories. And I commend them. These are parents who genuinely have suffered real loss, whose children and families have been harmed by corporate greed. And they are going to their lawmakers and saying, do something about this, hold these companies accountable. And it's not those parents' fault that lawmakers have decided to take the easy way out and push a crappy piece of legislation that says it protects kids when it doesn't. That's on our lawmakers. And so I sort of see our job as Fight for the Future, and the job of other human rights advocates is like holding those lawmakers accountable, because in the end, it's like, I want to be working with those parents. Like, we should all be united because we all want the same thing, which is like to see these big tech companies go down and be replaced by, having a world where we can actually find social media and online tools that allow us and our kids and our families to express ourselves, where we have safety provisions and content moderation and privacy policies that fit our needs, and where if we don't like it, we can take our followers and go somewhere else. And I know obviously this is work you've worked on a lot and other folks have worked on a lot, and we're seeing some glimmers of hope with, adoption within the Fediverse, within Blue Sky, et cetera. And so I do think we're in a moment where we can almost taste it, like it's there.
It feels like it was impossible. It feels like it was impossible for so long. It's like you can't fight the 500-pound gorilla that is Meta, and there's just nothing to it. And when I first started proposing, we should do social media protocols, and it felt like there were a dozen people out there in the world that were working on the Fediverse and working on these other emerging protocols, Scuttlebutt and all these other little teeny protocols. And we were off in the wilderness saying, we can build a radical different alternative. And everybody else is like, no one will ever use this. What's so wrong with the current system? How are we going to do it? And, I remember pitching a protocol to Jack Dorsey 2016, 2017. And he's like, this is really cool. And then he took it to Twitter management, other engineers, and they're like, no, this will totally destroy our business. And
that's the point.
yeah, that's the point. Like, the point is that, like, you shouldn't, like, Jack Dorsey shouldn't be the person who has to decide whether or not to ban Donald Trump's account. Like, that we have a single person deciding what speech is acceptable in the world is a fundamentally flawed thing. And the work of all these protocols, the stuff I'm doing with Divine and the trying to bring back Vine as an open protocol, it's really exciting because it feels like we have movement behind it. But, I don't know if you came across this thing I've been advocating for a while called the Social Media Bill of Rights, which is like, how do we go beyond just privacy and say, what do we really need? You need to own your identity and your followers. It's yours. It's not some rented account that exists on a server. You need transparency and agency over the algorithms. We're not going to exist in a world without algorithms. Even sorting them by time is an algorithm.
Yep.
But you need to know what it is, and you need to be able to choose. And we need not a monoculture. And you need the right to exit, to interoperability. You can leave Blue Sky servers and go to Black Sky. You can go from one Mastodon server to another. In the Divine and the Nostr ecosystem, you can choose what servers you want. You need the right to self-governance. Like, this is the crazy thing that on the internet, we don't have as much rights as exist in a community garden club where, whoever created the group owns it forever. And one thing you guys have been campaigning a lot on is privacy and security. Like, we need to be able to have private conversations that are encrypted and work over the internet.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with all of that. And you just listed off like 5 pieces of legislation that Congress could do right now that would meaningfully change the social media ecosystem and address a lot of the harms that a lot of the organizations and lawmakers that support bills like KOSA, could be pushing for. And that's one of the things that's been so frustrating about this for me, again, because, like, I hate wasting my time, opposing legislation that, like, tech lobbyists also oppose. They can fight their own battles. Like, forget them. And I would so much rather be spending my time, like, uniting with folks to pass legislation to take them down. But the reality is, like, a lot of these bills actually would benefit the largest players. And we've seen that. I mean, with KOSA, like,
so
Microsoft,
true. It's a kind of regulatory capture.
Exactly. Like, the largest players are the ones that have the lawyers and internal mechanisms and can afford to figure out how to comply, and also who don't care, right? Like, Instagram is very happy to just shove, like, random sanitized, like, videos of cute cats down your throat all day as long as you keep clicking and scrolling. They don't care whether their platform is, like, useful for politics or useful for organizing or useful.
And in fact, they would rather it not be. Like,
right.
Other than the fact that they love the engagement and everything else, politics is messy. Politics causes people to rise up. And if they could easily have a social media ecosystem that wasn't useful for political organizing, they would prefer that. It's part of why they love these new AI influencers, because AI influencers never speak out about the genocide in Gaza. They never go off message. They just say what the brands want them to say. So KOSA, the Kids Online
Safety Act. Yep.
It's come up a couple times over the years. I wonder if you could just explain what it is and what it does, and give us a bit more context, because a lot of people don't follow all the different legislation that goes back and forth, and they don't know what it is or what it's advocating for. And in particular, to me, it's so surprising because I've sat down and talked to some congressmen and said, okay, this is the Social Media Bill of Rights, and this is what we need to do and everything else. And then they go and co-sign KOSA. And it was just like this, it's very frustrating because they're feeling like they should do something. And yes, they should do something. But what is KOSA, and what is it going to do to the internet, and where is it at right now?
Yeah, for sure. So KOSA stands for the Kids Online Safety Act, as you said. It was originally introduced, I believe, in 2021, and it was co-sponsored by Senator Marsha Blackburn, Republican from Tennessee, and Senator Richard Blumenthal, Democrat from Connecticut. It is worth noting that Marsha Blackburn has been caught on a hot mic explicitly stating that her hope is to use legislation like KOSA to censor LGBTQ content, or as she referred to it, the transgender in this culture, was her direct quote. But let's talk about like what the bill actually does, how it's constructed. So let me start by saying there's a few things in KOSA that are fine or good. The bill tries to take aim at social media platforms' design practices. And this is certainly what the bill's sponsors have said. They say, no. This isn't about content. It's just about design. And, you and I were just talking about a bunch of stuff that we don't like that big tech social media platforms do.
There are a lot of design problems.
There's a lot of design problems, right? There's using your personal data for algorithmic recommendations, which we know can be addictive and harmful. Things like autoplay and infinite scroll, where one video ends, the next one starts. Those are all things that are like worth talking about and that I would argue the government actually can regulate. Like, I think like the Federal Trade Commission can absolutely look at something like autoplay and say, this is a harmful and deceptive business practice, and you shouldn't be able to do it on platforms of a certain size. The problem with KOSA and where it goes off the rails is it contains a duty of care, which is essentially a legal requirement for platforms to ensure that their recommendation systems do not lead to kids feeling depressed or anxious. And this is the standard. Originally, the bill had a whole bunch of other stuff in it, but they've kind of narrowed it down now to this standard of depressed or anxious. And like, that sounds really reasonable on paper, right? Like, okay, depression, anxiety, those are like concrete medically defined things. That's not related to, originally there was some stuff in the bill that made it a little more explicit around gender identity or things like that. They've really narrowed it to this anxious or depressed. But here's the problem. The bill allows the Federal Trade Commission to enforce it. And the Federal Trade Commission is a government agency that swings depending on who's in the White House. Right now, the FTC is run by Andrew Ferguson, who has already held a major anti-trans workshop and has made it clear that he wants to use the agency to go after providers of gender-affirming care and go after social media platforms that host content related to LGBTQ issues, etc. And so we have a situation where the Trump administration is more than willing to argue that simply learning that trans people exist makes kids depressed and anxious, that learning about the existence of gender-affirming care makes kids depressed and anxious, that learning that there are TV shows that have queer and trans characters in them makes kids depressed and anxious. And, we've been talking here, and there's been a lot of focus on the impact specifically on LGBTQ content, but this standard is so wildly broad and vague that it could be used to go after anything. I mean, the video of Renee Nicole Good being shot makes me depressed and anxious, and I'm a grown-ass adult. And so you can easily imagine an administration arguing videos of ICE violence make kids depressed and anxious, and they should be suppressed on social media.
Videos of war crimes.
Videos of war crimes and what's happening in Gaza. I mean, you mentioned this earlier, there's always this hand-wringing of like what the kids are doing, and it's not limited just to Republicans. I mean, there were Democrats that basically were like, the reason so many young people are opposed to what's happening in Gaza is because they're on TikTok, as opposed to like the other way around, that like young people are opposed to what's happening in Gaza and they're expressing themselves on TikTok. It must be the TikTok, not the genocide. But so anyhow, zooming all the way back. So KOSA creates this duty of care. And basically, the bill is sort of constructed in this vague way where it never says like you have to censor this content, but there's no meaningful way that a platform could comply with a law like KOSA other than either age gating, so collecting government ID and basically, creating a totally different experience for people under 18 and over 18, or actually I think the standard is 17 in KOSA as it currently stands, or using basically AI to filter content. And I think like this is the other thing, like everyone's up in arms and is like AI sucks and it's bad at like identifying and analyzing content. And now basically what we're saying is like, we want you to use AI.
Let's write into the laws. You have to use it.
To write into the law that like you have to use AI to suppress all the bad stuff and make sure we're only feeding our kids good stuff. And the reality is like, that's just not how the technology works. That's not how the law will play out. And what this will basically do is if I'm Meta and I'm a lawyer for Meta, what I'm going to say is you should algorithmically suppress all content that the current administration might argue makes kids depressed or anxious. And when there's a new administration, I'm going to be that meta lawyer and I'm going to say, you should now suppress all the content that might make this administration come after us. And what's actually interesting is we've actually seen Republicans in the House have basically made that argument. They've said, we're concerned that a future administration could use this to go after anti-abortion content, could use this to go after, Christian content, etc.
Militias and all sorts of,
right. And
things like that.
I hate to hand it to them, or sometimes it's the, like the worst person has made a great point meme. But like, they're not wrong. I mean, and this is exactly why we have the First Amendment. And this is exactly why we have been so hesitant for so long to put the government directly in charge of what we can see and do online. And I think what's been frustrating or confusing about KOSA is the bill's supporters have really tried to argue that it's not about speech and that it's only about these like design and recommendation systems. But the reality is they're obscuring the fact that like right now on every major social media platform, everything you see is either algorithmically amplified or algorithmically suppressed. And so if you create liability for platforms, as in you can get sued or in trouble with the government if you algorithmically amplify a piece of content, as in show it to anyone, then their choices are either algorithmically suppress the content that might get us sued or age gate and, kick off everybody under a certain age. Both of those lead to widespread privacy issues, to censorship, cut young people off from access to information, including life-saving information, and also just kneecap the ability of young people to use social media to organize. I mean, we were just, again, talking about Gaza. Obviously, last year and the year before, young people, particularly students, were using social media as a major site of organizing on their campuses and elsewhere. And it has moved the needle on an issue that has been pretty stagnant for quite a long time. And then, we see the youth climate strikers. We see folks like Greta Thunberg. I mean, I want social media policies that protect kids without silencing the Greta Thunbergs of the world. I don't think that's too much to ask, because we need our kids to grow up not just with safety, but also with basic human rights.
And we need to keep the door open for continued generations of change. You talked a little bit on there about the idea of age verification. This is something I also care a lot about, and something that's been in the news, where Australia implemented this sort of famous legislation now, which claims that they're going to fine companies who let minors 16 and under use this kind of social media knowingly. So if the social media companies know that there's a minor using it, then they will do something. And the argument has been twofold. One, maybe they'll just use AI to magically detect what a young person does and looks like and talks about. Or they'll do facial recognition, or they'll check everyone's IDs. I know that even though that's not directly in KOSA, one of the implications of it for the US would be the only way to comply with this law, or the easy way in which they can comply with this law, is to just ID everybody. And, I live in New Zealand, where there's a proposal for this, and the proposal is amazing because it lacks privacy protections. It just says, there's only one little line about privacy protections, and it says that if you are a minor who is banned from social media, the companies should protect your privacy and private data. But what it means
Right.
is they now have to collect the data on everybody, and they can keep it and they can use it for whatever they want. How is it that we end up in this world where, in order to protect kids, we don't realize that you can't do it without identifying everyone if you're going to filter them out? I wonder if you could talk about sort of how does age verification work, and why is it problematic?
Yeah, totally. Great questions. And I think, to be totally honest, like part of how we land here is, again, like people with good intentions and a lack of understanding of how the technology works and what the kind of risks associated are. So with age verification, I think part of the issue is like we already have age verification in a number of like instances that we're all very familiar with, right? You go to the liquor store, you show your ID to buy liquor. You go to the airport, you show your ID, you buy cigarettes or, whatever. So like we're kind of familiar with it in those contexts.
Ironically enough, in New Zealand, you don't need an ID to fly. You never show your ID when you fly. But
I love that.
It's a very small country.
Yes.
I love the fact that you can fly with privacy and you don't need your ID. But almost
great.
Everywhere else in the world, you do have to show your ID.
Right. But almost everywhere else you do. And, and again, in terms of online age verification, it's more similar to like I said, like showing your ID to buy alcohol or something like that. But when you go to the liquor store to buy alcohol, the clerk looks at your ID and says, yeah, that seems like you. They don't, take a photo of your ID, store it in their database forever, match it with a biometric scan of your face that they also store forever, and then use to train their store AI facial recognition detection system.
And then connect it to stuff from data brokers, because you guys run a whole campaign about data brokers. So all of a sudden, now they know exactly who you are. They know exactly who everyone is. And you've now empowered their algorithmic advertising engine.
Absolutely. And then, what you're also doing is you're entrusting your government ID, very sensitive information, or a biometric scan of your face with a private company. And we all know that private companies have a terrible track record of safeguarding our information. I mean, how many times a year do you get an email from your health insurance company or your credit card company being like, hey, sorry about this, but, data breach, oopsie. We may have lost some of your sensitive data, but we're really sorry. And we're going to sign you up for 3 months of free credit reporting to make it up to you or whatever. And, but the reality is if your credit card leaks, you can go get a new credit card. If your social security number leaks, you can go get a new social security number. If a biometric scan of your face leaks, you can't go get a new face. If your government ID with a photo of you leaks, that's can lead to really serious privacy harms. And that's before we even get into all the ways, as you said, that the companies themselves could be using, abusing, selling, monetizing, training AI on this new trove of data that the government is now basically not just kind of giving them the green light to collect, but actually forcing them to collect. And it's kind of wild, right? We're these big tech companies are so evil and they collect too much of our data. Anyhow, we're going to pass a law that makes them collect even more of our data. The reality is these policies are sort of they sound reasonable on paper. You need to show your ID when you go buy alcohol offline. You should have to show your ID if you want to go read wine reviews online. You have to show your ID before you go buy an adult magazine at Barnes & Noble. You should have to show your ID before you go log into an OnlyFans account. These things all sound like they make sense until you get into the actual technical implementation of how you do it. And then you realize that they really just lead to more harms. And I think that's where, again, the solutions to some of these problems are not actually technical solutions. They're societal solutions, right? If every young person had access to a safe place to sleep at night, trusted adults who they can go to if they come upon a piece of content that makes them uncomfortable or a message from a stranger that seems suspicious. So much I feel like so many of these folks that say they want to protect kids are just not actually interested in listening to kids. And it's really hard to protect kids when you don't listen to them. But if you actually listen to your kids and have a trusting relationship, and as you said at the outset, engage with the content they're watching. I try to the amount of videos about Minecraft that I have subjected myself to just so that my kid doesn't feel ashamed coming and talking to me about what kind of content she's consuming, has rotted my brain. But what it actually has led to is we do have a trusting relationship. We can talk about what she's experiencing online. And, I do think that that's important. I will say, I think that the pushback on that is it shouldn't only be up to parents. And I do think there is a role for policy and for government to address some of these harms. I also think there's a huge role for technologists and software developers and people to keep trying to build our way out of this and build the better alternatives that we need. And that's why I commend folks like you that are actually out there trying to build the thing and be see, it doesn't have to be this way. But I think it's a combination of all of the above, right? And in some ways we need some policy I think, to get us from here to there, because frankly, the level of monopoly and monopolization that the current kind of cabal of social media companies have is so intense that I think they've kind of been able to nuke from orbit a lot of the alternatives that have come up. But I think that's starting to shift. I think, a lot of people jumped ship from X when Elon Musk bought X, and there have been big exoduses from some of the other platforms. And I think folks are starting to see that there can be alternatives. But I do think to really see that massive societal shift, we would need some policies to crack down on the big tech companies' ability to, enclose, make it harder for people to leave, kill or buy competitors as they get popular, et cetera. And those are if lawmakers want to quote unquote do something about big tech, gosh, they have some real options. Antitrust legislation and privacy legislation are right there. They're bipartisan. They're not as controversial as legislation like KOSA that raises these free speech issues, but they also don't sound as sexy on paper as, the magical protect the kids and get rid of the terrorists and, save the puppies bill.
The TikTok law, the one that was passed in order to force the sale of the American part of TikTok to American investors. Nominally, they said they were doing it because they were concerned about private data. They were concerned about user data going to China. And you're like, well, why don't you just pass a privacy law? And the United States has no privacy law. But I want to get back to something you talked about, which is how do these monopolies keep their monopolies? What is it structurally that we've got set up? And I had Cory Doctorow on, who was talking about the way in which these companies are using DRM, using copyright law in order to create locks on your technology. But you, with Fight for the Future, have run a campaign around, freeing the iPhone, around looking at these app stores, the way in which you install it and what can be installed on your phone as itself a really important kind of control and censorship, and also reinforcing of the existing giant corporate monopoly. So I'm wondering if you could talk about that campaign a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, this has come up in some kind of interesting ways. It was a couple years ago where there were folks on the left that were really pushing for Apple and Google to ban Parler from the App Store. Right-wing social media app.
There's a push right now to ban Grok.
There's a push right now to ban Grok. And I'm no fan of Parler. I'm no fan of X or Grok. And, I would even argue with Grok, it does seem like Grok is probably violating Apple and Google's App Store policies. And it wouldn't be unreasonable for them to enforce those policies. And I don't want to live in a world where two companies get to decide what software we can run on the devices that we own. And, we've seen this play out. It's been rare in the US that there has been kind of explicit app censorship, although not it's not unheard of. There was
it happens.
Ice Block.
Yeah, they kicked off the Ice Trap.
Yeah, the app that was used to track ICE agents got kicked out of the App Store, while the app that ICE agents are using to conduct facial recognition on the street remains in the App Store. So again, these companies they're not brave. They want to make money. They will do whatever they feel like they have to do to appease the powers that be. And what it creates is a situation where you can censor almost any app with two emails, one to Google and one to Apple, if you're a government with enough power. And so I think, we've called to basically abolish the App Store. And really, we need to have a fundamental right to be able to write and run software on devices that we own. It seems like a kind of obscure issue or something that only, I'm not even a technologist, right? When people start talking to me about their cool Linux build, I'm like, sounds great, buddy. Don't know what you mean, but I'd love to hear it. But, we can all kind of, I think one thing I often say to non-technologists is this is as foundational as any other issue I think we can imagine. And especially as we head into a world with AI agents, with wearable tech, with, so many more things that we own being connected to the internet, connected to each other, our ability to pick and choose what software we run on devices we own and not have software forced down our throats is going to be like one of the most foundational human rights issues of the next 100 years, I would argue. And we're, again, like, we're kind of in a battle right now between this like walled garden, closed, you pick the kingdom that you want to live in and you hope the king keeps you safe situation, which is where we are now. And then, but it could be different. We could have a much more open environment, which doesn't necessarily mean that you couldn't still choose to live in one of those walled gardens and be like, all right, I'm only going to trust the apps in this app store from these people. But it would be
you can install software on your computer that would only let you go to certain websites and blocked all the porn sites so you couldn't go into it. And the funny thing is, like, we have on our computers the ability to install any software we want. But the thing we have with us all the time is this phone. That is the primary way in which most people access the internet, and we don't realize that there's a tremendous amount of control and very little freedom in terms of what apps do. And Apple and Google, they're, along with credit card companies, oddly enough, major regulators of speech in the internet that we have today. And they say they're doing it for our protection, but this gets into another campaign that you guys have run, which is around data brokers, because there are little extensions in all of these apps that are used for advertising that collect your location information, your activity, who you're around, what you're doing, all of this information, and then they sell it on a private market in these massive markets. And I know that Fight for the Future has been working on a campaign around these data brokers that we don't even know are happening. And, and it's on your phone and it's in your car too. So I wonder if you could talk about, like, what the hell is going on with data brokers? Because most people don't even know they exist.
Yeah, no, 100%. And again, this is like one of these things where it's just so frustrating because, like, politicians love to like talk about big tech and how they're tough on big tech and, they're going to do something about this. And again, we have no national privacy law in the United States. It's a national embarrassment. And we have essentially no regulation of the data broker industry, which allows, without a privacy law, companies can more or less collect as much information about you as you want. And with this unregulated data broker market, they can buy and sell it to almost anyone else. And, the most visible version of this is, if you've ever like Googled your own name, there's all these like people finder sites that promise you like, oh, do you want to find out if your ex has a DUI or, court records, that kind of stuff. But there's, that's just kind of like the tip of the iceberg. And what is hidden behind all of that is just enormous amounts of data that gets bought and sold around. Some of it is quote unquote anonymized, as in, well, we're going to sell a whole bunch of location data, but we're not going to tell you exactly whose it was. But often that anonymized data, which any technologist can tell you, can be de-anonymized and then reassociated with individual people. After the Dobbs decision, when Roe v. Wade was overturned, I feel like I got like basically every reporter in the country called me to ask about period tracking apps specifically. And there definitely were data concerns there. But what I said was, your Candy Crush game on your phone is just as likely to rat you out for having been sitting in an abortion clinic as your period tracking app. Because the reality is, as you said, basically every app whose business model is rooted in surveillance advertising is collecting some type of sensitive data on you. And then that data can be bought and sold. What I will say is there are some glimmers of hope on this issue. It's been one of the few tech issues that's been a little bit more bipartisan. I think partly because, again, even Republican senators are worried about their own private data being bought and sold. And so we have seen some efforts. There's actually a California provision in the CCPA that basically makes it easier with like one click to opt out of a whole bunch of data brokers at the same time. And we've been actually advocating for the FTC to do that at the federal level in the same way that they have like a do not call list for advertisers that a lot of people are familiar with. You should be able to go to one single government website and say, I want to opt out of data brokers, and they should have to respect that. That would be like one simple step that the FTC could do right now that would meaningfully protect people. And, that's actually like a bipartisan idea that we could fight for and actually get implemented sometime in the next couple of years. So some glimmer of hope in these trying times. But I think, again, just to bring the issue back home, there's data brokerage, and then there's just data sharing that happens as well. And we know, for example, that Flock, the surveillance company that does license plate scanning, has been sharing data with ICE in some circumstances. I don't even think they're selling it. They're not even making money of it. They're doing it for free as a way to sort of bone graft themselves to the US government surveillance apparatus, because they see that as their future profit model, basically selling these surveillance devices to towns and cities. And, being buds with ICE is a good way to help them do that. So again, all of these different things kind of weave together. The remedies lie in strong privacy legislation, in designing our technology to be surveillance resistant, and then, holding accountable our elected officials. We have mayors on TV right now saying, fuck ICE, but if their city has a Flock contract,
and they're not canceling,
talk is cheap.
There are a few cities that actually have recently canceled their Flock contract and removed these license plate trackers that are handing it over. But I don't think that enough people know about it. They don't realize that it is possible to stop some of this surveillance, and that movements of people need to not just do the showing up in the streets the way people do done in Minneapolis and across the United States with whistles when ICE happens, but we need to set the space by which we have that privacy and that we continue to organize. I would love for you to talk about what people could do. People who care about this, they care about an internet that lets them organize, that protects their privacy, that lets them be creative, that escapes a corporate monopoly around that. How can people engage in the struggle and work with Fight for the Future?
Yeah, for sure. The first thing I would say is just these are not problems that are going to be solved overnight. And so with any other activist cause, what I always encourage folks is find a group or a way to stay involved. There is no one magical, hey, if you just give us $100 right now, we'll take it and we'll go save the internet. Or, if you just sign this one petition. And so I really encourage folks to get involved. We're out here, Fight for the Future. Obviously, you can follow us on social media. Obviously, we, are a small nonprofit. We need donations and support. There's also a lot of other folks out there doing this work in different ways. EFF is obviously very well known, does a lot of litigation on this issue. The folks at CDT are doing a lot of work on this issue, but also folks like Mi Gente, who have been doing tremendous work on specifically the ways that ICE is leveraging surveillance to terrorize immigrant communities. Folks like Media Justice, who have done work for years on surveillance and privacy and censorship issues with a specific focus on impacts on Black and brown communities of color. There's a lot of great organizations out there doing the work. And I would mostly just encourage folks follow a few of them, stay involved over time. It does matter to sign those petitions, to make those emails and calls to legislators, but it's also all politics is local. And we've seen, small groups of people that have gotten together to go hold a meeting with their senator about these issues. We've had a coalition just here in Massachusetts that organized a Queers Against Censorship karaoke party to pressure Senators Markey and Warren to oppose the Kids Online Safety Act. So there's lots of different ways that people can get involved. But I just also really encourage folks to find something that works for you. Maybe you don't love going out in the street and marching around, but you're great at creating social media videos that organizations can use to raise awareness. Volunteer. We need help. We need developers. We need designers. There's lots of ways that people can help. And so I just encourage folks to find something you can do with other people on a regular basis. That's the best way to get involved.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I encourage everyone here to go check out Fight for the Future. I am just so thankful for all the work that Fight for the Future has done in terms of really advocating for a better internet for all of us. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rabble. Always great to chat with you.
Thanks again to Evan Greer for coming on revolution.social. Our intro and outro music is a remix of the Italian anti-fascist song Bella Ciao, courtesy of White Records.
This episode was edited and produced by Eric Johnson from lightningpod.fm. Our executive producer is me, Alice Chan, from Flock Marketing.
To learn more about the Social Media Bill of Rights and to sign up for our email newsletter, visit revolution.social.
And for more interviews like this one, follow revolution.social on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, nostosfountain.fm, or wherever you get your podcasts.
And to paraphrase the Zapatistas subcomandante Marcos, we need a social media revolution to make revolution possible. We'll be back next week. See you then.